I never expected falling asleep in the back row of my economics lecture to change my entire semester. If you'd asked me that morning what my biggest problem was, I would have said sleep. Not grades, not money, not my social life. Just sleep. Or more accurately, the complete lack of it. My name's Owen, I'm 21, and during that particular semester I was balancing a full course load, a part-time job at a grocery store, and enough stress to power an entire campus. So when Professor Levi caught me asleep in his class, I figured I was done for. Professor Levi wasn't old, which somehow made him more intimidating. Maybe 33, 34 at most. He taught behavioral economics with the kind of energy that made people actually pay attention, even to graphs and statistics. Well, most people. I was usually one of the students who sat near the front, answered questions, and actually read the chapters before class. Usually. But after covering an overnight shift because my coworker had called in sick, I'd gone home at 5 in the morning, showered, convinced myself I could survive the day, and somehow made it to campus. Barely. I remember opening my notebook, writing the date, Levi explaining something about decision-making biases. Then, nothing. The next thing I heard was laughter. My eyes snapped open. The classroom looked blurrier than usual, and for a terrifying second I had no idea where I was. Then I noticed everyone looking toward me, including Professor Levi. He stood at the front of the room with one hand resting on the podium, completely calm. "Welcome back, Owen." A few students chuckled. Heat rushed into my face so fast I thought I might actually pass out from embarrassment instead. Sorry. No need to apologize," he said evenly. "I was just wondering whether you'd like to answer the question." Every eye stayed on me. I stared at the whiteboard. I have absolutely no idea what the question was. More laughter. I wanted the floor to open beneath me. Professor Levi smiled, not in a mocking way, but like he genuinely appreciated the honesty. I figured as much. He erased the board. "Let's start over." And just like that, he repeated the explanation from the beginning. For me, nobody complained. Nobody rolled their eyes. He simply restarted the discussion as though the previous 5 minutes hadn't happened. That somehow made me feel even worse. The second class ended. I packed my bag faster than anyone else. My only goal was escape. I had almost reached the door when I heard it. "Owen." I froze. There was no pretending I hadn't heard him. The room emptied around me until only Professor Levi and I remained. He organized a stack of papers while I slowly walked back toward the front. "You wanted to see me?" He looked up. "I did." Great. Here came the lecture. Academic responsibility. Attendance. Professionalism. Maybe even a warning. Instead, he leaned casually against the desk. "Are you all right?" The question completely caught me off guard. "Yeah." He didn't seem convinced. "You've never fallen asleep in class before." "I've just been busy." "Busy enough to pass out?" I rubbed the back of my neck. "I picked up an overnight shift." "You worked all night?" I nodded. "And came straight to class." Another nod. He was quiet for a few seconds. "I appreciate dedication," he finally said, "but not if it comes at the expense of your health." I didn't want to miss the lecture. I noticed. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. I couldn't help laughing awkwardly. I guess I made a pretty memorable impression. I've had students snore before. Seriously? Oh yes. That surprised a laugh out of me. You, however, managed to answer honestly instead of pretending you'd been resting your eyes. I didn't think lying would have worked. It wouldn't have. We both smiled. The awkwardness eased just enough that I could finally breathe again. Then he asked something I wasn't expecting. "How are your grades in your other courses?" I blinked. "They're actually pretty good." I checked. You checked. I was concerned. Concerned. Not annoyed. Not angry. Concerned. It was strange hearing that from someone I'd only spoken to a handful of times. "I've noticed your assignments are consistently strong," he continued, "which is why today seemed out of character. I swear it won't happen again. I'm less interested in promises and more interested in whether you're burning yourself out." Nobody had asked me that in months. Not my manager. Not my classmates. Not even my roommates. I shrugged. Rent doesn't really pay itself. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. Understanding. I remember being a student. You worked while studying too? He laughed softly. 3 jobs. Seriously. I became very familiar with coffee. Guess I'm on the same career path. I hope not. For the first time since waking up in class, I wasn't thinking about how embarrassed I felt. I was just talking. Felt surprisingly easy. Then another student poked their head through the open classroom door. Professor Levi, your next meeting starts in 5. He glanced toward the hallway. Right? Thank you. The student disappeared again. Levi looked back at me. We'll continue this another time. I nodded. Thanks for not making a huge deal out of today. He smiled. Get some sleep tonight, Owen. I will. And next time you feel yourself drifting off, leave. No. He picked up a marker and pointed toward the empty seat in the front row. Move there. So you can keep an eye on me? So I can throw an eraser at you before you fall asleep. I laughed. I'll keep that in mind. As I left the classroom, I couldn't stop smiling. I told myself it was just relief, that nothing about the conversation meant anything beyond a professor checking on one of his students. At least, that's what I believed when I walked out of that room. I had no idea that staying behind after class would become the beginning of something that neither of us expected. For the next week, I made sure I never sat in the back row again. Not because Professor Levi had told me to, because I refused to relive the embarrassment of waking up to an entire lecture hall staring at me. So every Tuesday and Thursday, I claimed the same seat in the front. Close enough that if I even blinked too slowly, Levi would notice. The annoying part? He actually did. Halfway through Thursday's lecture, while explaining a case study, he paused and looked directly at me. You still awake, Owen? A few students laughed. I raised my coffee cup. Barely. Good enough. The lecture continued. It was such a tiny exchange, but afterward 3 classmates started joking that I'd become the professor's favorite target. If you fall asleep again, one of them laughed. He's gonna make you teach the class. I'd fail all of us. You'd probably still get extra credit. I rolled my eyes. You're all hilarious. Still, I couldn't deny something had changed. Not in a dramatic way. Professor Levi didn't treat me differently than everyone else. If anything, he was careful not to. But every now and then, I'd catch him glancing toward the front row whenever he asked a difficult question. Sometimes I'd answer. Sometimes I'd completely blank. Either way, he'd nod thoughtfully before moving on. Felt encouraging. A few days later, I was stocking shelves during my evening shift when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored those. Something made me answer. Hello, Owen. Yes. This is Professor Levi. I nearly dropped an entire box of cereal. Professor, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I'm at work. I'll be brief. I stepped into the empty storage room. Is everything okay? I wanted to let you know tomorrow's seminar has been moved online. You called me for that? I noticed the department email accidentally left your address off the mailing list. Oh, there was a short silence. I figured it was easier to call than let you show up to an empty classroom. I smiled without realizing it. Thanks. No problem. I appreciate it. Try not to work too late. I laughed. I'll do my best. Good night, Owen. Good night, Professor. The call ended. I stared at my phone for another 10 seconds. One of my coworkers walked into the storage room carrying a pallet jack. You look weird. Huh. You're smiling. I am not. You definitely are. I shoved my phone into my pocket. It was nothing. He raised an eyebrow. If you say so. The following week, I stopped by Levi's office hours. Not because I needed help. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I had a question about one assignment. Technically, his office door was open. Books covered nearly every surface. There were coffee mugs everywhere. Stacks of papers threatened to collapse off his desk. You can come in. he said without looking up. I haven't even knocked. I heard footsteps. I stepped inside. This is a lot of books. He finally looked up. They're multiplying. I think they already won. He laughed. Probably. He gestured toward the chair across from him. What can I help you with? I pulled out my notebook. We spent 15 minutes discussing the assignment. Or at least we started there. Eventually the conversation drifted. You work at Green Mart, right? He asked. Yeah. How's that going? Depends whether customers remember how to read sale signs. I'm guessing they don't. They absolutely do not. He smiled. I worked retail once. You survived. Barely. I knew professors weren't born wearing blazers. I'm offended. I've never even seen you in a hoodie. I own one. I don't believe you. He opened a drawer. Folded inside was a faded gray hoodie. I laughed. No way. I wear it at home. This changes everything. It shouldn't. It absolutely does. He shook his head, smiling. You've recovered remarkably well from falling asleep in my lecture. I still think about it every day. I was hoping you'd stopped. Not a chance. He leaned back in his chair. For what it's worth. Yeah. I forgot about it days ago. You did. I remember conversations. He paused. Not embarrassing moments. Something about that sentence settled quietly in my chest. He wasn't saying it just to make me feel better. He meant it. I looked around his office again. You really spend all day in here? More than I'd like. It feels lonely. He glanced around the room. I suppose it can be. I immediately regretted saying it. Sorry. For what? I don't know. He smiled. You don't have to apologize for noticing. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Just quiet. Then a knock interrupted us. Another professor stepped inside. Levi, faculty meeting. He sighed dramatically. My favorite part of the week. I'll let you go, I said, standing. He nodded. Take care of yourself. I will. And Owen? Yeah. I'm serious about getting enough sleep. I laughed. I know. As I reached the hallway, he called after me one last time. No overnight shifts before exams. I'll try. No. He smiled. I'm assigning homework. I grinned. Yes, Professor. Walking across campus afterward, I realized something. The conversation had lasted nearly 40 minutes. Only 15 of those had been about economics. The rest had simply been two people talking. I told myself that was normal. Professors had office hours. Students asked questions. Conversations happened. There was absolutely nothing unusual about it. Even if, for some reason, I found myself looking forward to the next lecture more than I wanted to admit. By midterms, Professor Levi's class had somehow become the one I looked forward to the most. Not because economics had suddenly become my favorite subject. Because it was the 1 hour every Tuesday and Thursday where my brain finally slowed down. Levi had a way of making people think without making them feel stupid. If someone answered incorrectly, he never embarrassed them. He'd simply ask another question until they figured it out themselves. It made the room feel different from every other lecture I'd taken. Safer. A week before midterms, he announced a group project. The collective groan from the class was immediate. I see enthusiasm is high, Levi said dryly. A girl near the back raised her hand. Can we pick our own groups? You may. Within seconds, everyone started moving. Chairs scraped across the floor. People called to their friends. I looked around. Most of the people I knew had already formed groups. Great. I wasn't exactly antisocial, but I wasn't close enough with anyone in this class to just invite myself over. I started putting my notebook away. Maybe I'd email Levi later and ask if there was another group looking for one more person. Owen. I looked up. Professor Levi stood near the front of the room. Hang back for a minute before you leave. A couple of nearby students exchanged curious looks. My face warmed. Again, after everyone else filed out, I walked toward the front. Everything okay? He nodded. I noticed you didn't find a group. I was going to email. I figured. He glanced down at the roster. There's another student in the same situation. He picked up a folder. I'll introduce you. A minute later, another student walked in. Ethan, this is Owen. We shook hands. Turned out Ethan commuted from another town and usually left immediately after class, which explained why he didn't know many people either. You two should work well together, Levi said. I think so, Ethan agreed. We exchanged numbers. Made plans to meet at the library Saturday morning. Problem solved. As Ethan left, I turned back toward Levi. Thanks. It wasn't exactly difficult. Still, he smiled. I've learned that sometimes students need introductions more than instructions. I laughed. That sounds like something you'd put in a textbook. I'll remember that. Saturday morning arrived far earlier than I would have liked. Ethan and I met at the library. He turned out to be funny, organized, and significantly better at spreadsheets than I was. By noon, we'd already finished outlining the project. I expected this to take all day, I admitted. So did I. He closed his laptop. You hungry? Before I could answer, someone walked past our table. Owen. I looked up. Professor Levi. He was carrying 2 books and wearing the hoodie, the gray hoodie he'd shown me in his office. For a second, I honestly didn't recognize him. No blazer, no dress shoes, just jeans, sneakers, and the hoodie. He looked younger, more relaxed, like an entirely different person. Oh, he glanced down at himself. The hoodie exists. I laughed. I owe you an apology. You doubted me. I really did. Ethan looked between us. You two know each other? Levi answered before I could. Owen occasionally keeps himself awake during my lectures. Hey, it was one time. So far. I shook my head. I'll never escape that, will I? Probably not. The 3 of us laughed. Levi looked at the books in front of us. Project coming along? Actually, yeah, good. He smiled. I'll let you two get back to it. He started walking away, then stopped. Oh, he turned back. Nice work introducing yourself to Ethan. I blinked. You remembered? You seemed worried. He gave a small nod before continuing across the library. Ethan watched him disappear around the shelves. Your professor seems nice. He is. He also remembers weirdly specific things. I noticed. Ethan grinned. I think he likes you. I nearly choked on my coffee. What? As a student. Oh, relax. I wasn't. You definitely were. I buried my face in my hands. Can we please work on the project? He laughed. Sure. But the comment stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. A few days later, the first midterm grades were posted. I stared at my screen. 98%. I refreshed the page twice just to make sure it wasn't a mistake. Then my email chimed. From Professor Levi. Excellent improvement. I had a feeling getting more sleep would help. I couldn't help smiling. I replied before overthinking it. Turns out not falling asleep during the exam was a good strategy. His response came only a few minutes later. Highly recommended. Thursday afternoon, I stopped by his office again. You emailed me. You replied. Fair point. He leaned back in his chair. So, 98. I tried not to smile too much. I got lucky. You studied. Also true. You should give yourself credit. I looked down. I've never really been good at that. He was quiet. Most high-achieving students aren't. That sentence landed harder than he probably realized. Because it was true. No matter what grade I earned, I always focused on the missing points. Never the ones I'd actually gotten. He seemed to notice my expression soften. You don't have to be perfect all the time. I know. Do you? I didn't answer, because I honestly wasn't sure. A gentle knock interrupted us. The department secretary leaned inside. Levi, your 3 o'clock canceled. She disappeared before either of us could respond. Levi looked back at me. I suddenly have an empty afternoon. Lucky. It happens once every decade. I laughed. He glanced toward the window. You heading home? Eventually. What are you doing until then? Probably pretending to study. He smiled knowingly. I was going to grab coffee. I nodded. Sounds nice. There was a brief pause. Then he seemed to catch himself. Well, he picked up a stack of papers. I should grade these, right? I stood. See you Tuesday. See you then, Owen. As I walked out, something felt unfinished. Like there had been another sentence he almost said but decided against. I couldn't stop wondering what it had been. And for the first time since this all started, I realized something that made me more nervous than I'd expected. I wasn't just enjoying Professor Levi's class anymore. I was starting to enjoy every conversation we had outside of it, too. The weeks passed faster than I expected. Between classes, work, and our project, life settled into a rhythm that finally felt manageable. I stopped taking overnight shifts, not because my manager suddenly became understanding, because Professor Levi had somehow convinced me that constantly running myself into the ground wasn't something to be proud of. You look less like a zombie. That was the first thing he said as I walked into class one Tuesday morning. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. A couple of students laughed as I took my seat. For the rest of the lecture, everything felt normal, comfortable, familiar. It was becoming dangerous how much I enjoyed those little exchanges. A few days later, Ethan and I met to finish our presentation. We practiced in one of the study rooms until nearly 7 that evening. When we finally packed up, Ethan glanced toward the campus cafe. You want coffee? I probably shouldn't. So, yes. I laughed. Fine. The cafe was almost empty. We ordered our drinks and found a table by the window. 5 minutes later, the front door opened. I looked up. Professor Levi. He spotted us almost immediately. For a split second, he looked surprised. Then he walked over. Working late. Ethan nodded. Trying to survive the presentation. Levi smiled. A worthy goal. He looked at me. You remembered to eat dinner this time? I blinked. You remembered that? The previous week, I'd casually mentioned skipping lunch because of work. Apparently, he'd filed that information away somewhere in his brain. I try to. Ethan looked between us again. You really remember everything. Levi shrugged. Occupational hazard. The barista called his name. He picked up his coffee. I'll stop interrupting. As he turned to leave, he looked back at me. Don't stay here until midnight. I won't. I'm serious. I know. He gave a small nod before heading out into the evening. Ethan waited until the door closed. Okay. What? I definitely wasn't imagining it before. I sighed. Don't start. I'm not saying anything weird. Good. But he clearly cares whether you succeed. I looked down at my coffee. He cares about all his students. Maybe. Ethan smiled. But I don't think he remembers what everyone had for lunch. The presentation went better than either of us expected. When we finished, Levi nodded thoughtfully. Strong analysis. He asked a few questions. We answered them. Then class ended. As everyone packed up, he handed back our evaluation sheets. At the bottom of mine, he'd written one extra sentence. You should be proud of this work. I read it 3 times. Nobody had ever written something like that on one of my assignments before. The semester rolled on. Then came the day everything shifted. I was leaving the student center after my afternoon class when rain started pouring so hard it sounded like gravel hitting the windows. Perfect. I hadn't brought an umbrella. Of course I hadn't. I stood under the entrance with about 20 other stranded students. Looks like you're stuck. I turned. Professor Levi stood a few feet away holding a black umbrella. You too. I parked on the other side of campus. So did I. We both looked out at the rain. It wasn't slowing down. Not even a little. Levi checked his watch. I have a meeting in 15 minutes. I have work in 20. We exchanged the same look. Neither of us was making it on time. Unless he lifted the umbrella slightly. My car's about halfway between here and the faculty building. I stared at it. You sure? It's just rain. I hesitated. Every logical part of my brain said it wasn't a big deal. Every emotional part of my brain suddenly became very aware that we'd be walking across campus together. Okay, the umbrella wasn't exactly large. The moment we stepped into the rain, we automatically moved closer together, close enough that our shoulders brushed every few steps. The wind pushed the rain sideways. Levi adjusted the umbrella. "You're getting soaked." "So are you." "I'm taller." "I noticed." He laughed. "I'll survive." For a minute we simply walked. Students hurried past in every direction. The campus looked completely different in the rain. Quiet, gray, almost peaceful. "You know," Levi said, "I nearly skipped graduate school." "Really?" "I was exhausted." "What changed?" "A professor." I looked over at him. He convinced me that being tired wasn't the same thing as being finished. The words stayed with me. "You've had a lot of good professors." "I've been lucky." We reached the faculty parking lot. He stopped beside a dark blue sedan. "Well," I looked toward the employee parking area where my bike was locked another 100 yards away. "I guess this is where we split up." He looked at the rain, then back at me. "Your bike's still across campus." "Yeah." Another pause. "I can drive you." I shook my head immediately. "You don't have to." "I know. It's out of your way." "Not by much." "I'd feel bad. I'd feel worse watching one of my students bike home in this weather." I laughed quietly. "You really don't give people much room to argue." "I've been told that before." Finally, I nodded. "Thanks." The drive lasted less than 10 minutes. Mostly small talk. Music played quietly through the speakers. The car smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. When he pulled up outside my apartment building, the rain had finally started easing. I reached for the door handle. "Thanks again." "You're welcome." I climbed out. Before closing the door, I leaned back in. "Professor." "Yeah. I'm glad you asked me to stay after class that first day." His expression softened into a warm, genuine smile. "So am I." I closed the door. As his car disappeared down the street, I stood there for a long moment in the light drizzle. I told myself I admired him because he was kind, because he believed in his students, because he'd helped me through one difficult semester. But standing there watching his taillights disappear, I finally admitted something I'd been trying very hard not to think about. I had a crush on Professor Levi, and I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Realizing I had a crush on Professor Levi should have made everything obvious. Instead, it made everything complicated. Because no matter how I felt, he was still my professor. That fact sat in the back of my mind every time I walked into his classroom. So I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to flirt. I wasn't going to read into every smile. And I definitely wasn't going to make things awkward. If anything, I tried a little too hard to act normal. Apparently, Levi noticed. The following Tuesday, I arrived early and took my usual seat. He was setting up his slides when he glanced over. "Morning, Owen." "Morning. You look unusually serious." "Do I?" "You frowned at your notebook 3 times." "I have not." "You just did it again." I looked down and laughed despite myself. "Okay. Maybe I did. Everything all right?" "Just thinking. Hopefully about economics." "I can't promise that." He smiled lightly before turning back to the projector. That was the end of it. No questions. No pressure. Just another class. And somehow that made it easier to keep my emotions in check. A week later, the department hosted a career panel for graduating seniors and upper year students. Attendance wasn't required, but I went anyway. After the presentations ended, students gathered around different professors asking questions about graduate school, internships, and research. I found myself standing near the refreshments, debating whether to leave. "Owen." Levi walked over carrying 2 paper cups. "Coffee?" "You remembered. You usually say yes." He handed me one. "Thanks." We stood near one of the windows overlooking campus. "This semester's gone by quickly," I said. "It always does. I'm actually going to miss this class. I'll miss teaching it." I looked at him. "You mean this group?" He nodded. "Every class is different. There was a brief silence. Then he added, "Watching students become more confident is one of the best parts of the job." I couldn't help smiling. "You've definitely helped with that." "I'm glad." Before either of us could say anything else, another faculty member approached. "Levi, they're looking for you." "Coming." He looked back at me. "Good luck with finals." "You too." He laughed. "I don't take finals." "Still seems stressful." "It is." He headed toward the front of the room, greeting another group of students along the way. Watching him, I realized something important. The kindness I'd experienced wasn't something reserved for me. It was part of who he was. He encouraged nervous students. He listened carefully. He treated people with respect. Oddly enough, that didn't make my feelings disappear. It made me admire him even more. Final exams arrived before I felt ready. I buried myself in notes, practice questions, and enough coffee to keep an entire cafe in business. The economics final was my last exam of the semester. As everyone filed into the lecture hall, Levi placed the exam packets face down on each desk. "No tricks," he said. "You've prepared for this." A nervous laugh spread through the room. He looked around. "I believe you're capable of doing well." For some reason, hearing that settled my nerves. 2 hours later, I handed in my paper. As I reached the front, he accepted it with a small nod. "Take care of yourself over the break, Owen." "You too, Professor." For a second, it felt like there was more either of us could have said. Neither of us did. I walked out into the sunshine wondering if that had been the last time I'd ever speak to him. 3 days later, final grades were posted. I stared at the screen. Not just in economics. In every class. I leaned back in my chair and laughed out loud. My phone buzzed a minute later. It was an email from the department. "Congratulations on completing the semester." A second email appeared underneath it. From Professor Levi. "Congratulations on a strong finish. You earned it." That was all. No long message. No personal conversation. Just a sincere note from a professor congratulating a student. I smiled as I typed my reply. "Thank you for everything this semester. Your class made a bigger difference than you probably realize." I hit send. Then I closed my laptop. The semester was over. Professor Levi was no longer teaching me. For the first time, the clear boundary of professor and current student had changed. What, if anything, that might mean in the future, I had no idea. But I also knew that whatever happened next, it needed to happen with the same respect and professionalism that had defined every interaction we'd had so far. The first week after finals felt strangely quiet. For months, every day had been planned around lectures, assignments, and work. Then suddenly, nothing. No early alarms. No discussion sections. No last-minute studying. Just long shifts at the grocery store and a lot more free time than I knew what to do with. I kept catching myself thinking about campus. More specifically, one professor. I told myself it would fade. That once enough time passed, I'd stop wondering how Levi was doing. Didn't. About 2 weeks into break, I stopped by campus to return a library book I'd forgotten about. The place felt almost empty. Summer classes had started, but compared to the regular semester, it was quiet. After dropping the book off, I cut across the main quad. "Well, that's good timing." I turned. Professor Levi stood a few yards away with a messenger bag over one shoulder and an iced coffee in his hand. For a second, we both looked equally surprised. "Owen." "Hi. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I had an overdue library book." He laughed. "So you're one of those students." "I returned it. Eventually." "I'd like that noted." "I'll consider it." It was the easiest conversation we'd ever had. No classroom, no office, no lecture waiting to begin. Just two people who happened to run into each other. "How's your summer?" he asked. "Mostly working." "The grocery store?" I nodded. "You remembered." "I remember conversations." I smiled. "And you?" "Research." He made a face. "Lots of meetings." "So, about the same." Unfortunately, we started walking without really deciding to. The path around campus was shaded by old oak trees, and neither of us seemed in a hurry. "I got your email," he said after a moment. "The one after grades?" "Yeah. I meant what I wrote." "I know." He looked ahead instead of at me. "Messages like that mean more than students probably realize. You helped me a lot. You did the work. You still helped." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Eventually, he broke the silence. "I should tell you something." I looked over. "You were one of the easiest students to teach." I laughed. "The one who fell asleep? Believe it or not." He smiled. "You asked good questions." "I asked a lot of questions." "Exactly." We reached the small campus cafe where we'd both been countless times during the semester. Levi stopped outside. I was about to grab another coffee. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "If you're comfortable with it." He chose his next words carefully. "Since you're no longer my student, would you like to join me?" My heart skipped. Not because it sounded romantic. Didn't. It sounded respectful. Measured. Like he'd spent time thinking about whether it was appropriate to ask. I nodded. "I'd like that." We found a table near the window. For the first few minutes we talked about completely ordinary things. Summer weather, books, a documentary he'd recently watched. Without realizing it, I stopped thinking of him as Professor Levi. He noticed before I did. "You almost called me professor again." "I know. You don't have to. It feels weird." "I understand." I smiled awkwardly. "So, Levi, there you go." "It still sounds strange." "You'll get used to it." I wasn't so sure. An hour disappeared without either of us noticing. At one point Levi checked his watch. "I've monopolized your afternoon." "You definitely haven't." "You sure?" "I came here to return one book. And I somehow ended up having coffee with my former economics professor." He laughed. "When you say it like that, it does sound a little unexpected." "It does." There was another comfortable silence. Finally, he folded his hands on the table. "I've been careful." I looked at him. "About what?" "About boundaries." "I know. I wanted to make sure the semester was completely over before even asking if you'd like coffee." I appreciated that he'd said it out loud. "I noticed." "I hope it didn't make you uncomfortable." "It didn't. It mattered to me that it was appropriate." "It mattered to me too." Our eyes met for a brief moment. There was something different there now. Not the dynamic of professor and student. Just mutual respect. And curiosity about where this friendship might go. When we stood to leave, Levi adjusted the strap of his bag. "I enjoyed this." "So did I." He smiled. "Would you want to do it again sometime?" I felt myself smiling before I answered. "I'd like that." He nodded once. "Then I'll email you." "You still have my address?" "I do." I started walking toward the parking lot before turning back. "Levi." "Yeah. I'm really glad I fell asleep in your class." He laughed. "I never thought I'd hear a student say that." "Neither did I." As I drove home that afternoon, I realized something. For the first time, I wasn't looking forward to the next lecture. I was looking forward to getting to know Levi as a person. And somehow, that felt even more exciting. Levi kept his promise. 3 days after we met for coffee, an email appeared in my inbox. Subject: book recommendation. There wasn't much to it. Just the title of a behavioral psychology book we'd briefly talked about, followed by one line. Also, the cafe near the river has much better coffee than campus, if you're interested. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. I replied almost immediately, "Only if you promise not to quiz me afterward." His response came 20 minutes later. "No quizzes. That's one of the advantages of summer." The cafe overlooked the river that cut through the city, with a wooden deck stretching over the water. It was quieter than anywhere near campus. Levi was already there when I arrived. This time he wasn't carrying a laptop or a stack of papers. Just a paperback novel and a cup of coffee. "You made it." I figured I shouldn't keep my former professor waiting. He laughed. "I think you're allowed to stop calling me that now." "I'm working on it." "You are." I sat across from him. For the first time, There wasn't an invisible line separating us. No classroom, no office, no grades, no assignments. Felt surprisingly normal. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about economics, about everything else. His hometown, my family, the jobs we'd had before college, the movies we both secretly enjoyed despite pretending they were terrible. At one point, I asked the question I'd been wondering about for months. Why teaching? Levi looked out toward the river before answering. I almost didn't. What changed? I had one professor who convinced me I was capable of more than I believed. I smiled. Sounds familiar. He looked back at me. Maybe. I've been thinking about something. What's that? I spent most of the semester assuming you treated everyone exactly the same. I tried to. Tried. He nodded. I never wanted you to feel singled out. You didn't. I was careful. I noticed. He rested his coffee cup on the table. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't rooting for you. I looked down for a second. I'm glad you were. As the afternoon stretched on, we wandered along the riverside path. The conversation came easily now. Comfortable silences didn't feel awkward anymore. Eventually, we reached a small footbridge overlooking the water. Levi leaned against the railing. I've wanted to ask you something. Okay. He hesitated. Not because he seemed unsure of himself, because he seemed determined to choose the right words. When the semester ended, he paused. I realized I looked forward to our conversations as much as you seemed to. My heart started beating a little faster. I wasn't sure whether I should say anything. I wasn't either. I didn't want you to feel pressured. I don't. I also didn't want there to be any question about ethics while you were my student. I respected that. He nodded. I'm glad. The breeze stirred the water beneath us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I took a breath. Can I be honest? I hope so. I had a crush on you before the semester ended. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I suspected. You did. A little. I thought I was hiding it. You were doing a pretty good job. Apparently not. He smiled warmly. You were respectful. So were you. Another quiet moment passed. Then he met my eyes. I'd like to take you on an actual date. Not coffee between a professor and a former student. Not a chance encounter on campus. A real date, he repeated. But only if that's something you want too. I couldn't stop smiling. I'd like that. You don't have to answer immediately. I just did. He laughed softly. I suppose you did. A week later, he picked me up just before sunset. No campus. No discussion of grades. Just dinner at a small Italian restaurant neither of us had tried before. Conversation flowed as naturally as it had over coffee. When the restaurant closed, we walked through the downtown streets, laughing about everything from terrible first jobs to the fact that I had once mistaken salt for sugar while baking. I still can't believe you admitted that. I trusted you. You probably shouldn't. I've learned that. As we reached my apartment building, we stopped on the sidewalk. I had a really good time, I admitted. So did I. For a moment, we simply stood there. Neither of us seemed eager to end the evening. Levi spoke first. I'd like to see you again. I was hoping you'd say that. He smiled. So, second date? I'd love a second date. The smile that spread across his face was impossible to miss. As I watched him walk back toward his car, I realized something that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. The professor who had once caught me asleep in the front row had become someone I genuinely wanted in my life. And this time, whatever happened next wouldn't be built on lectures or assignments. It would be built on honesty, patience, and the choice to get to know each other, one date at a time. The second date turned into a third. The third turned into weekend walks, late-night phone calls, and coffee that somehow lasted 3 hours because neither of us ever seemed to run out of things to talk about. It happened gradually. There wasn't one dramatic moment where everything suddenly changed. Instead, it was 100 small moments. Levi texting to ask how my shift at work had gone. Me sending him a picture every time I found a ridiculous economics headline online. Him recommending books he thought I'd enjoy. Me teasing him whenever he showed up with yet another coffee in his hand. "You know," I said one afternoon as we sat in the same riverside cafe, "I still haven't seen you without coffee." He looked down at the cup in front of him. "That's actually a fair point. I knew it. I'm willing to admit I have a problem. Progress. I didn't say I planned to fix it." I laughed so hard that the people at the next table glanced over. "You really are impossible. I've been told." By the end of summer, spending time together had become the easiest part of my week. One Saturday morning, we wandered through a local farmer's market. Levi insisted on buying peaches because they were scientifically the best fruit. "There is absolutely no science behind that." "There is." "No. There could be. That's not the same thing." He grinned. "I appreciate your commitment to evidence. See? You can't stop being a professor." He stopped walking and looked at me. "I hope that doesn't bother you." "It doesn't. You've never seemed intimidated by me." "I was." "You hid it well. I literally fell asleep in your class." He burst out laughing. "I don't think you'll ever let either of us forget that." "Never." A few weeks later, the university's new semester began. I wasn't taking any of Levi's classes anymore, and our lives no longer overlapped academically. Even so, we agreed to be careful. Campus was still his workplace. If we happened to run into each other there, we kept things professional. Outside campus, that was different. One evening, we were walking through the park after dinner when we reached the small lake at its center. The sun was setting, turning the water orange and gold. "It's strange," I admitted. "What is?" If someone had told me 6 months ago that the professor who caught me sleeping in class would end up standing here with me, I shook my head. I would have laughed. Levi smiled. "I probably would have too. I thought you were going to yell at me that day. I considered waking you by asking a question." "You did. It worked." "Technically." We both laughed. Then the conversation settled into a comfortable silence. After a moment, Levi turned toward me. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "The day you stayed after class." He folded his hands into his jacket pockets. "I wasn't upset that you fell asleep." "You weren't." "I was worried." "For me?" He nodded. "You looked exhausted." "I was." "I remember thinking," he paused, "that if a student who normally participated suddenly couldn't stay awake, something outside the classroom was probably wrong." I looked down. "Thank you for asking instead of assuming I didn't care." I've learned that asking usually tells you more than assuming. As we continued walking, our hands brushed together. Neither of us pulled away. A few steps later, I looked at him. He looked back at me with a small, questioning smile. I reached over first. Our fingers slipped together naturally. No rush, no grand declaration, just a quiet decision we both seemed ready for. "It took us long enough," I said. "A little. Worth it." He didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely." I smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." A month later, I stopped by his office, not as a student, but because he had forgotten a book in my car. The department secretary smiled knowingly as I handed it over. "He's in his office." I knocked. "Come in." Levi looked up from his computer. "You rescued my book. I figured you'd eventually notice it was missing." "I noticed yesterday." "So only 24 hours. I'm improving." I handed him the book. He set it on the desk before looking at me. "You know." "What?" "I've been thinking about that first conversation we had." "The one after I fell asleep?" "Yeah. I remember thinking you'd probably never want to speak to me again." I laughed. "I remember thinking I'd embarrassed myself beyond repair. And now," I looked around the office. The same overflowing bookshelves, the same mugs, the same desk. Everything looked exactly as it had months earlier. Only now everything felt different. "Now," I said, smiling, "I'm kind of grateful I couldn't keep my eyes open." Levi laughed. "I suppose I am too." He stepped closer. "I'm really glad you stayed after class that day. I almost ran out the door." "I know. Good thing I didn't." "It was." He smiled with the same warmth I'd first noticed months before. Not because I was one of his students anymore. Not because he'd helped me through a difficult semester. But because we'd taken the time to build something honest, patiently, and respectfully. Looking back, it was funny. I thought the most embarrassing moment of my college life had ruined everything. Instead, it introduced me to the person who would end up changing my life in the best possible way. Sometimes the moments you wish you could erase become the ones you're most grateful ever happened. And every now and then, whenever Levi caught me dozing off on the couch during one of our movie nights, he'd smile, nudge my shoulder, and say the same thing he had on that very first day. "Welcome back, Owen." This time I just smiled, because I knew exactly where I belonged.